Today it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Brian Jacob. Brian has a number of positions. I couldn't memorize them all, so I'm just going to read them. Please forgive me. He is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of Education Policy. He is the Professor of Education, Professor of Economics, and Director of the Center on Local, State, and Urban Policy. All of this at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. He is also Research Associate at NBER and Executive Committee member of the National Poverty Center. Previously, he was an analyst at the New York City Mayor's Office and a middle school teacher in East Harlem. He has a number of research interests. In fact, I think every time I Google some kind of ed policy issue, Brian Jacob papers always come up everywhere. It's impressive. His primary fields of interest are labor economics, program evaluation, and econ of ed. Today his talk is entitled Family Income of Child Outcomes, Evidence in a Randomized Housing Lottery. It took place in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jacob.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm glad you could all make it. And, so the paper I'm presenting is joint with a colleague, Jens Ludwig, who's now at the University of Chicago. Was at Georgetown, although as a lesson to graduate students here about how not to wrap up a project. This was a project that started when I was a graduate student, like in 2000 or so, at the University of Chicago. We have written a little bit on it, but this is one of the first papers, and this is still kind of a draft version, so there was, as you recognize, there was no actual paper associated with it yet. But yeah, so this is, we keep changing the title now. It's titled Poverty and Education, Evidence from a Randomized Housing Voucher Program. And so I'll just jump right in. So I think we kind of start by thinking about the goals of modern social policy. And kind of as we have surveyed the landscape, we have think of social policy trying to address at least two goals. One is to improve the short-term material needs of individuals. But a second goal is at the same time, ideally, enhancing the long-term productivity and self-sufficiency of disadvantaged people. And this was actually, if you go back and look at the history of social policy, this is kind of ingrained in a lot of the writings about it. So this is a quote from Lyndon Johnson in announcing the war on poverty. Very often a lack of jobs and money is not the cause of poverty, but the symptom. The cause may lie deeper in our failure to give our fellow citizens a fair chance to develop their own capacities, and a lack of education and training, and a lack of medical care, and most importantly for us here, housing. And so I think implicit in this view is that one, these kind of other non-education social policies can have an impact on long-run outcomes, including long-run educational outcomes, and that they may be an important part. This is, this kind of ties into some debates that have gone on for a number of years within the education policy realm, debates about whether intervention should be focused on schools and teachers specifically, or should address broader societal issues. And this, just recently again, Helen Ladd, a professor who probably most of you are familiar with at Duke, you kind of articulated the focus on society, broader society, rather than simply on schools in her presidential address to the Association of Public Policy and Management. So current education policy initiatives are misguided because they deny or set aside the basic body of evidence documenting that students from disadvantaged households perform less well in school. Addressing the educational challenges faced by children from disadvantaged families will require a broader and bolder approach to education policy than recent efforts to reform schools. So I think we, I guess that's kind of a backdrop for this paper as well. And so kind of an overview of the paper. Essentially, at its root, what this is a study of the impact of a large social assistance program, namely housing vouchers, on the long-run outcomes of low-income children. But we think of this as kind of helping us to answer three related questions. One, there's kind of the simple program evaluation. What's the long-run impact of this providing a rental subsidy? I think this is an interesting and important area in general. For some reason, housing policy is not particularly sexy, and so if you I mean, if you look, there's more money is spent annually by the federal government on housing than Title I or Pell Grants or TANF. I mean, it's surprising how large it is. And then you look at the number of kind of applied papers that are written on this relative to those written on Title I or TANF. I mean, it's kind of disappointing. So there's the simple program evaluation. I think there's kind of maybe a deeper, I label kind of dramatically the deeper social science question. What's the impact of income itself on long-run child outcomes? And so I think we're going to try to use this as a context for answering that, and now I'm going to talk a lot more about that. But basically, the simple idea is that a large part of the treatment of a housing voucher is an income supplement. There are some other things here and there, but I think I'll be able to convince you that that's a large part of what you get when you get a housing voucher. And so this might be a nice context to answer that question. And then how cost effective is at least one non-education social program in improving educational outcomes, and how does this relate to some other education-specific programs? So that's the kind of the general goals of the paper. Contributions to the study. One, I think, is that we're using a randomized lottery for housing vouchers that's going to provide some convincing identification. We have a very large sample of children and adults with very detailed administrative outcome data, and we have a very long run follow-up period. So the intervention, the housing voucher lottery occurred in 1997, and we have outcomes running till the current day.
Brian?
Yep.
Just one question on that third question. This just seems, I mean, maybe I should be patient and wait to see what you do. But it just seems like this is almost impossible to do, in that really determining the cost effectiveness of it, if it can affect so many different outcomes, safety.
Oh no, right. So this is the the third one is basically getting at the question: if your goal is to improve educational outcomes, like kind of what Sunny Ladd is focused on, improve high school graduation, do we want to do that by just fiddling with class size, or do we want to do that by trying to address the larger social context of urban school children, for example? But so you're right. This is not going to be. I mean, this could be you could broaden this to like a complete cost benefit analysis of the whole program. So I guess that could be a fourth component. But this is. I mean, I think the way we think about this is like the first one is essentially what we had kind of set out. What we initially 10 years ago were interested in looking at it just for its own sake, and I think as we've learned more about this, we think that we can actually have a reasonable answer to number 2, and can at least start to say something about number 3, although I think Sunny, like a fair point that she would make, is okay, you're telling me about how one of hundreds of potential social policy, non-education directly focused social policies, and so what if this one isn't terribly cost effective, maybe the other 999 really are, and so we still shouldn't be doing standardized testing. We should, I mean, so her argument could go through regardless of this, the results here. So, I'm going to first talk about some of the housing vouchers, just generally how they work, what the rules are, and then what that says about the potential mechanisms for them to affect long-term outcomes. I'm going to talk a little bit about prior literature that relates to this, literature on housing programs and on income supplements. I'm going to talk about the specific program that we're studying, data, empirical strategy, some results, and interpretation and discussion. And so I shall, in addition to thanking Jens, I'm going to have to thank all the RAs over the years who have helped, including Eric Taylor here, who's provided lots of the RA assistance and more for this, including a great graphic that I'm really excited to show you about halfway through. So how does a housing voucher work? So a family, basically, it's a income-dependent program. You need to have qualified by having an income below a certain level, which is set relative to the official poverty rate. the family, if they're offered a voucher, they have to find and rent an apartment on the private market themselves. There's some requirements. The apartment must meet some basic quality standards, and importantly, the landlord must be willing to accept voucher recipients. Because the way it works is the voucher recipient rents an apartment, and then the government pays the landlord directly their share of the rental, and the tenant pays the landlord, him or herself, the remaining part that the landlord is owed. So there's a maximum rent that is allowed. It's called the fair market rent. It's usually around the 40th percentile of the metropolitan statistical area's rent distribution, but it varies by the size and gender composition of the household. So if you have more kids, you're qualified to rent a bigger apartment and spend more on rent. Just to give you a sense, in 1997, the year this was implemented, kind of a two-bedroom apartment in Chicago was about $732 per month. That was the rent. So families can lease. There are some exceptions where families can lease an apartment if they want to spend more than the FMR and pay the difference themselves. But in practice, the vast majority of housing recipients, housing voucher recipients, just find an apartment that's set exactly at the FMR and rent it. And then the household is required to contribute roughly 30% of its adjusted income toward rent. And the adjustment takes into account other social benefits the family is receiving, and dependent care that they can deduct and so forth. And so they usually end up paying about 21% of gross income. Now, in many cases, their gross income is zero. Like these, are people who are unemployed, who have their only source of income is public assistance or food stamps. Let's see. Okay, so what is the treatment here? So for public housing, I mean, probably if you've heard of housing vouchers and seen any studies on them, you've heard of Moving to Opportunity, which was a study that provided housing vouchers to public housing recipients. And for that group, it was basically just a change in the form of housing assistance. Going from a place-based public housing to having the government subsidize your housing through a private market rent. Here, for families who were not receiving any rental assistance at baseline, the voucher is a completely new subsidy. And you can see if they're only, think about, they're only required to contribute 30% of their income toward rent, the government is going to pay the rest. You can kind of start to realize how big an amount of money over the course of a year that's going to be saving a low-income household. So what it's going to do is it's going to allow households to consume more housing, because generally their rent that they were paying before receiving a housing voucher was lower than what they're allowed to rent with the voucher. But it's also going to increase their discretionary income, because all of the money they were paying for rent before, they won't have to. The government is subsidizing it, and so they're going to be able to spend it on, food, educational, technology for their children, a new dishwasher, et cetera, et cetera. Sean?
Is there any evidence that the landlords take some of this as windfall by raising the rents?
There's nothing good. We certainly, when you read some of the case studies and anecdotes, that comes up. I have not, if you look at the rent distribution in large urban areas, you don't see huge spikes like at the FMR, which you might expect if like every landlord is basically just charging the most they can get. I'm sure some of that has an effect. I'm sure that some of that goes on. And so so you might expect what they're getting is not much housing. That would be bad for them. In some cases, that would be even cleaner for our answering the second question, because that means really when we're estimating the effective income, there's nothing else going on. Yeah, so I think there's no good. People mention that, but it's not mentioned enough for me to think that it is kind of an obvious widespread occurrence. Because a lot of the, I mean, I should also note, I mean, these are very rationed. As you'll see, when Chicago opened this voucher, I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of families who applied, and they had a very limited number of these vouchers. And voucher recipients are living in the same buildings as non-voucher recipients. And so, I mean, what a landlord would have to be doing is kind of very targeted, you know, in a very targeted way, charging this family with the same characteristics more than that family. So it's not, I think that's what precludes a little bit of that happening. Okay, so the total subsidy, I mean, like at the second part of this talk, I'm going to go through exactly how much these are worth and so forth. But I think what you can think of is the total subsidy a household is going to get is about $10,000 per year, and they're going to get about $5,000 of that in increased housing, and about $5,000 of that in discretionary income. And this is on average, the population that we're looking at, their average total income, which includes earned income plus public assistance, is $14,000 a year. So this kind of subsidy has increased their total income, total kind of consumption of housing and other goods by 2/3, and increased their total disposable income, you know, maybe by 50%. So this is a huge increase relative to of income for families relative to other social programs. There's always a question, like this is an in-kind transfer, and so the total subsidy of $10,000 is not, you know, economists would say that's not worth as much as, in terms of, it doesn't have as much utility to individuals as $10,000 of unconstrained cash, which is right, and we're going to kind of think about that. I mean, it turns out the best estimates of the income elasticity of housing for poor families suggests that they actually pay, you know, poor families spend quite a high fraction of the marginal dollar on housing. And so, you know, the kind of equivalent, if you calculate the equivalent variation of this $10,000 subsidy, it's about $8,300. So you can think about this, you know, the best guess is that this $10,000 subsidy is equivalent to kind of giving families about $8,300 of unconstrained income. So, I mean, in some ways, we were thinking about this, or we are going to relate it later to some of the studies of the EITC and other programs that are pure income supplements. So here, I mean, this is kind of like a little graphic to help us think about some of the different channels that could be operating. So, for applicants living in private housing, their housing quality is going to go up. To the extent that Sean's concern is not, complete, they're going to be able to consume kind of a better, larger apartment, perhaps in a nicer area. The neighborhood quality could go up or could stay the same. I mean, you'll see that many of the households don't really move very far. I mean, they're within a mile of their original residence in a different apartment, but not in a dramatically different neighborhood. School quality, again, since they're not changing neighborhood much, could in theory go up. In practice, it doesn't look like it changed a lot. Family income definitely goes up. And this is kind of despite adult employment. Kind of in one of our earlier papers, we show that vouchers kind of reduce adult labor supply by about 15%. And this is both because of an income effect as well as a substitution effect, the fact that families have to contribute 30% of their income is essentially adding a 30% marginal tax rate to every additional dollar they earn. And so kind of basic microeconomic theory would suggest that they're going to reduce at least a bit their labor supply, and that's what we find in this earlier paper. But even given that, kind of total income does increase. So these are the potential channels we're going to go through that this kind of package of a housing voucher could operate through. So what I'm going to do now is basically go through the more straightforward program evaluation question, give you some intent to treat and treatment on the treated effects, and then come back to trying to interpret this in terms of the effect of income or housing or other specific mechanisms per se. So what is the prior evidence on housing programs? So there's one study that's actually the most similar to ours, which was a random assignment study done by Apt Associates focusing on AFDC recipients. And that was a program that was going to give housing vouchers to folks on public assistance. This was done kind of in the early 2000s, similar to our time period. Not in Chicago, but in a few other comparable areas or similar areas. They found that it increased total family resources, housing consumption, consumption of food, and to some extent neighborhood quality, but it had few, if any, detectable effects on children. I think this is kind of a preview. This is what we're going to find, at least the second bullet point. But they have a lot of limitations to the study, very small samples. They don't have any direct measures of child outcomes in terms of achievement scores or graduation rates or arrests and so forth. And it's limited to a 5-year follow-up, which may not capture all of the longer run impacts you might expect. Moving to an opportunity, which I alluded to before, I think provides some convincing evidence on kind of the impact of neighborhoods per se. I think out of all the results, I think what comes through the most clearly is there were some positive impacts on obesity and mental health for girls, but no impacts on crime or education for girls or for boys. There's a huge observational literature on measures of housing quality and child outcomes that has lots of problems with kind of inferring causality. But one of the interesting things that comes through in this is that, again, these health outcomes are the ones that seem to be the most strongly correlated. And so actually we have another paper that we're working on that's about 6 months behind this, where we're using Medicaid claims data linked to these children and families to try to look at health outcomes and healthcare expenditures. And to try, because we're not able to look at that in this paper. So this is some prior work of ours. We had one paper that was looking at adult labor supply for public housing residents, which is different than the sample used here. We have a paper showing there's a decline in mortality among girls in public housing who are offered a housing voucher. And we think that has something to do with the neighborhood change as well. Okay, prior evidence on income supplements. Lots of studies that report the correlation between, is there a clock in here? Okay. Let's see, so hundreds of studies that report these correlations were, some review and analysis by Susan Mayer in the late 90s suggested there was substantial omitted variables bias. She has some very kind of interesting and convincing analyses, like showing that future income is associated with current or past child outcomes, things that make you question the relationship between income and outcomes in general. There were some studies that used kind of sibling fixed effects, kind of a series of studies using PSID and NLSY that find kind of mixed results. And then there's a few new studies that all find kind of large positive effects of income that I think are kind of the biggest interest and or relevance for our study, and that we're going to have to try to reconcile our results with. One is there's a paper by Dahl and Lochter in 2012, which basically uses variation in the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, during the 1990s, and shows that an extra $1,000 of income boosts test scores for children, for Black and Hispanic children by 8% of a standard deviation, which is significant. Now, I think the obvious concern with that study, which they try to address in a few different ways, but I think is still a lingering concern, is basically their identification comes from changes in how children in poor households did across the 90s, basically from the early 90s to the late 90s. And there were lots of other things happening in society, including education, that we think may have increased student achievement during that period. There's a paper by Morris and Duncan where they take random assignment studies that MDRC had done, welfare to work experiments. All of the studies were basically the experiments were policies that either mandated maternal employment, kind of, remember this was the mid-90s, getting people off welfare, have to go back to work. They either mandated maternal employment alone or mandated maternal employment and gave the families an income supplement. And so by kind of comparing the results for kids across these two different types of interventions, they infer that an extra $1,000 of income increases child achievement by about 0.06 standard deviations, although this is only for the youngest children, and there's some other evidence that I can talk about later that suggests this is really due to the fact that when the single moms were forced to go back to work, what they spent the income on was formal child care. And so I think in some ways this is confirmation of the benefits of center-based care, literature on early childhood education. So there's a paper that looks at a Canadian child benefit income supplement. Huge impacts, $1,000 of income leading to a 0.36 standard deviation increase in student achievement. And then one that looks at variation from kind of profits from a newly opened casino on Native American reservation in North Carolina that shows some positive effects as well. So, so that's where we're coming to. So there seems like there is some evidence, at least the recent quasi-experimental evidence of positive effects of income on student educational performance. And so I think that's where we're trying to speak to that literature.
Ryan, what is in these studies? Is there a similar mechanism that describes why the money should increase the test scores?
So all of the authors kind of cite similar thing, everything from parents literally purchasing kind of things that are directly educationally relevant, like tutoring or books, to kind of spending that would reduce household stress. There's a whole kind of series of things like that. They're not the only study that actually looks at how families spent their money and what could explain this was the last one, but that focuses on the Native American reservation in North Carolina, and they find generally families were kind of spending over a wide range of things, not so much books or tutoring, but other things that you could indirectly affect.
Anybody mention nutrition?
That nutrition is not mentioned directly. I mean, it's usually when they talk about food, they're talking about kind of, I guess, reducing kind of. It might be reducing the stress of food insecurity, although that doesn't come up often in these articles. A lot of these are kind of large data set, black box studies that don't delve a lot into the mechanisms. Oh no, we know better than that. No, so we're following that proud tradition. So what we're going to be looking at a housing voucher lottery that took place in Chicago. So just some background. In 1995, HUD took over the Chicago Housing Authority. There was kind of well-known corruption and mismanagement there. It kind of tried to reform the agency and redid how the voucher program was structured. And kind of coming out of that, in July 1997, they opened up the housing voucher wait list for the first time in over 10 years. There were 105,000 income eligible applicants, households. 82,000 were deemed income eligible. ACT associates was working with them at the time, and they randomly assigned all 82,000 households to a wait list. And then the top 35,000 families were kept on the active waiting list. And they distributed the vouchers in the order of this wait list. Kind of the first 4,600 households got vouchers within about the first year. There was a hiatus when they had to serve a different, a different population for other reasons. Then, the next few thousand, 2000, 2001, 2, 3, and at this point, kind of in May 2003, they ran out of money and stopped giving out vouchers. So essentially, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at households with lottery numbers, 1 through 18,000, and comparing their outcomes to households with lottery numbers 35,000 and above. So what we're going to be, one of the reasons this has taken so many years, and I guess despite that we have no data inside the black box, or less than we would like, is that we've been getting most of our data through a variety of administrative data sources. We got the voucher application data from the Chicago Housing Authority Corporation directly. It provides demographic information identifiers for all the household heads and spouses. We link these to the Illinois Department of Human Service files, which collects information on various types of public assistance, AFDC, TANF, food stamps, and Medicaid. And then we use the household information in the IDHS files to identify the children in these households. And we take the children immediately prior to the lottery. We have some information on who utilized the vouchers and when through HUD. And then for a subsample of our data, we collect, we kind of track them to see where they move to using some passive tracking. We do that for a subsample for cost reasons. Then we're going to link this data to educational student records from the Chicago Public Schools from 1995 to 2011. So this is going to include test scores, high school attainment, school mobility. It actually includes now some measures of post-secondary enrollment that's obtained through the National Student Clearinghouse. And then we also link this to the Illinois State Police arrest histories, which is going to provide us arrests for different categories of crimes and at very specific times. So we're going to be able to create measures of criminal offending, measures of kind of criminal participation among their sample. Okay, so the analysis sample. What we do is we take households living in private market housing at the time of the lottery, so that in the, like I said, the treatment group is households with lottery numbers 1 through 18,000. The control group is households with lottery numbers 35,000 to 82,000. All these households have to appear on the Illinois Public Assistance files, so they were receiving some sort of public assistance prior. That's the vast majority of these households. I mean, the reason why they applied for housing vouchers is that they were low income, and so 85–90% of them were receiving other types of assistance. The individuals we pick are all the children aged 0 to 18 at the time of the lottery, as identified by the public assistance files. And we do some work to try to understand whether there's any differential selection into the sample. So the lottery number is not correlated with the probability that a household appears in these public assistance files prior to the lottery. It's not correlated with having a child in the household prior to the lottery. And it's not, for the most part, that's the asterisk, correlated with the probability of matching to CPS or the Illinois State Police files prior to the lottery. So there's a tiny bit of difference with the in one of those two, which I forget, but it's very small and marginally significant. So here's some summary statistics for the households. And the way I had this organized is this is our control group. This is all of the treatment group. So when you think about whether this was a true, the randomization seemed to kind of work in practice, you'll be comparing column 1 to column 2. The asterisks are for kind of individual variable comparisons. We end up doing kind of a joint test that tests the joint significance of all the covariates we look at, and that is, we can't reject the fact that there's jointly no difference. So what do we see here? We see that kind of just thinking about the population, this is largely an African-American, single, female-headed household population, as you might expect, public housing folks receiving housing assistance in Chicago in the late 1990s, perhaps not surprising. About 60% were receiving TANF in the second quarter of 1992. The average quarterly wage, about 46% of the household heads were employed at all, and the average quarterly wage was about $1,700. And this includes the zeros, so this is everybody. They're living in census tracts that are predominantly African American, very high poverty rates, high crime rates. Monthly rent is about $700 per month. And what they would qualify for if they got the housing voucher is considerably higher than that. So you can see the difference here. It's going to suggest where the kind of additional housing consumption will come from. And then this is for the youth in the sample. So again, largely African American. What else? Okay, so this. I think this is an old slide, and this is not the right units. I was going to refer to the units here, just to give you a sense. What you'll see coming up is kind of the student achievement of students kind of in this sample is about 1/4 of a standard deviation below the average in the Chicago public school sample. So I think this is an old table that has not been corrected yet. Okay, so our empirical strategy. We're going to look at first talk about estimating. We are going to have the data in the form of a panel of student year observations from 1998 to 2011. We're going to estimate just kind of models where we have an indicator. Let's see, the outcome student I in year T. The pre-offer indicator is an indicator that takes on a value of 1 for students in the treatment group prior to the time that they were offered a voucher. And this is largely, and this is relevant for the folks that were offered a voucher like in 2001, 2002, 2003. This would take on a value of 1 in the early years, 98, 99, 2000. This is mostly because we were interested in checking whether there was anything, I guess that people refer to as an anticipation effect. They knew that they got a good lottery number in 1997, and that might somehow change their behavior prior to actually receiving the voucher offer. It turns out that was almost always not significant. The post-offer indicator is really what I'm presenting as kind of the treatment effect. That's what you would generally think of. This is an indicator that takes on a value of 1 for treatment households in the years that they were after which they had been offered the housing voucher. We control for a series of covariates to increase precision and a series of year dummies. So the beta 2 is the ITT, intent to treat effect. It's basically contrasting the outcome of those who were offered a voucher with those who were not offered a voucher in the same year, conditional on these other covariates. I mentioned that. We're clustering the standard errors by household. And as I mentioned, the primary threats to the internal validity here is a lack of true randomization, which I think we have ruled out as best we can. Differential attrition, which for some outcomes is going to be a little bit of a concern. I'll get there shortly. And so we're going to estimate these intent to treat effects, but then we're also going to be interested in looking at the impact of the voucher offer on lease-up. And so there was some treatment crossover here. So some families with, quote unquote bad lottery numbers got vouchers through other allocations. So about 8.6% of the control group ended up utilizing a Section 8 voucher, compared to about 57% of the treatment group. So the difference is about 49 percentage points, and that so that is really going to be the first stage, and what we're later thinking of is our instrumental variable setup. Treatment households generally leased within 6 months of the voucher offer and continued receiving Section 8 for at least several years. For those of you that might wonder, like this, one of the things that I always wonder about and what people invariably ask about is why didn't a larger fraction of families who are offered the voucher utilize it? And it's a very good question. And the general explanations that you hear are difficulty in finding a place to lease, or you have other kind of complications in the lives of kind of low-income people. But this is, this is very, very in line with kind of every other study, and with even the not kind of studies, but if you generally look at just housing authorities and their fraction of folks that lease up, this is consistent with that. So, okay. So then I'm going to be showing you some estimates of the treatment on the treated, and so this is the impact of receiving and utilizing a housing voucher on the outcome, instrumenting leased with these kind of post-offer indicators that the first equation shows. This is kind of, I guess, standard setup in the program evaluation literature. I think many, if not most of you, have seen this before. And then we're going to be showing the control complier mean as kind of the comparison group for the treatment on the treated. Okay, so one of the things that we've tried to take a little bit more seriously in this paper, as opposed to other papers certainly that I've written, is the issue of multiple hypothesis testing. So we have dozens of outcomes and many, many potential subgroups that we would want to look at. Kids by different ages, by genders, by prior status, by household type. And pretty soon you're looking at dozens or hundreds of p-values, and you're not clear which ones could have, how many should have happened by chance. So the recommended practice in this case, recommended I say because very few, certainly I've rarely done this, and very few of the people colleagues that I have done this, not nearly enough, is to pre-specify the outcomes for your kind of main confirmatory analysis. Minimize the number of outcomes you're looking at, kind of potentially by using indices, aggregating different outcomes into kind of composite measures, and then adjusting the p-values to control for some measure of the probability of having a false positive. And there are several different ways you can do this. So for the inference, what we're going to do here is I'm going to show you two things. One is you can stack the data and jointly estimate all of your hypotheses at the same time, and do kind of an F-test of the null hypothesis of no effects for any of your estimates. And that's going to be reasonably well powered, but the disadvantage is it's just going to let you determine whether there is some effect or not which of the outcomes was significant. I'm also going to show you some what are known as kind of Q values, which are the essentially same interpretation as a p-value, but that account for this false discovery rate using an approach developed by Benjamini and Hochberg. It's conservative in the sense that it's kind of low power, but not nearly as bad as other approaches to this. Okay, so after much wrangling, we kind of narrowed it down to looking at 8 hypotheses. We're separating by gender and by age, kind of based on the prior literature suggesting effects could be different across gender and for different age groups. Our crime measure, we're going to have one composite measure of crime, which I'll explain shortly. We're going to have a composite test score measure and then high school graduation. So there's kind of 8 hypotheses we're testing. The composite achievement measure, we standardize the test scores by grade, subject, and year for the entire CPS, and then average math and reading scores. High school graduation, this is kind of conditional on enrolling in the Chicago Public Schools and does not include a GED. The social cost of crime measure that we use is basically a way to aggregate all of the different arrests for all the different types. It's essentially a weighted sum of arrests in any given year where the weights are determined various ways. This is kind of standard, my co-author Jens tells me, in the criminology literature. This kind of gives you some sense of the weight. So homicide is apparently worth $3.9 million, or costs society $3.9 million, all the way down to larceny, which costs society $370. And this is basically, you can do different things. You can aggregate the number of arrests. We're going to show you arrests by different crime category. But I think this is kind of a parsimonious way of summarizing individuals' criminal involvement. Okay. So what I'm going to show you now, I'm going to show you the main confirmatory analysis, kind of these 8 hypotheses. Walk through some of the results and talk about the multiple hypothesis testing. So here's the effects for boys. So the first thing to take away is here, the joint test of significance for all 8 hypotheses, the p-value is 0.046. So we can reject the fact that there is kind of zero effect, at the conventional level, but not particularly precise. I mean, it's not particularly precise. As we look through this, there are some positive effects for boys. And so what we're going to see is positive effects for boys and nothing for girls throughout this. Test scores for age 0 to 5. These are children who are age 0 to 5 in 1997, but looking at their test scores throughout. So the control mean here suggests that kind of folks in the control group, their average test score over this period was 0.33 standard deviations below the average for the Chicago public school system, which is slightly below average nationally. The intent to treat, the impact of being offered a voucher, increased the achievement of these boys by about 0.04 of a standard deviation. And the treatment on the treated, you interpret as the effect of actually using a voucher, kind of being using this housing assistance, is you can tell roughly double this, and that's what you would expect given that around the 50% difference between the control and the treatment lease up. So the impact of kind of having and utilizing a housing voucher was to increase the achievement of young boys by about 0.066 standard deviations. So not incredibly large, but not tiny, kind of given some of the other effects we kind of see in educational research. For the older boys, there was kind of no impact on standardized achievement. For the older boys, though, we're able, they have reached. The reason why we do this age split is partly because of evidence of larger effects for this very young group prior to age 6, based on earlier research. But also this older age group are the ones that we can observe till their age at least 20, and so we know whether they graduated high school or not. So this is the group for whom we have high school graduation. 30% graduation rate among this group, very low income, difficult population, obviously. And the intent to treat and the treatment on the treated is about a 4 percentage point increase. So this is kind of using a housing voucher increased the high school graduation rate by about 4 percentage points, or 4 over 30, 12%, something along those lines.
I'm trying to understand, because my understanding is some people got it at the first year, right? Some people got it 5 years later. So the people in the 0 to 5 category, they could have had it for anywhere between 1 to 5 years in that time period, right?
Oh no, so this is looking at, what this is looking at everybody who was 0 to 5 in 1997,
Right.
and then this is the impact of the voucher offer on this group over the entire period, from 1998 to 2011. So this is picking up their test scores. I mean, for the most part, they're only begin to be tested at age 8 in 3rd grade. So this is looking at their test scores in the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, which is much later, 2005, 2006, 2007.
Right.
And this is aggregating all of those years. Later I'm going to show you how the effect varies by time since voucher offer and so forth.
Okay, I'm just thinking like it's more of a dose model, I guess, because some people got it, the first 4,600 people got the lottery right in the first year, 1998. Right. So those people had many more years to.
Yeah, so this is,
right?
yeah, no,
It's
that's,
average overall.
yeah, this is just like kind of, there's lots of ways you could look at kind of heterogeneity by lots of dimensions, and one of them, I mean, I think what you're going to, one of the things you're getting at is kind of basically time having had a voucher.
Right.
I'll show you that in a little bit. And then, so crime, you know, a small reduction of about $217 in terms of the cost of crime off of a baseline of $2,000 for these boys. This is, it turns out that this is driven essentially entirely by a reduction in homicide. A tiny, tiny number fewer homicides per individual in the treatment group versus the control group, but they're valued highly, you know, that has such a high cost associated with it that it kind of leads to something that is, you know, small but statistically noticeable, at least at the 10% level. Okay, I'm going to go here, I'm going to come back. So for girls, we see basically nothing. So you see much smaller point estimates are not statistically different than 0. They are only in a few cases are they statistically different than the boy effects, but that's because we unfortunately don't have as good precision as we'd like. But I think what I take away from this is the effects for girls seems much different than boys. The crime, they have a kind of a tiny positive effect, which is due to kind of some you know, drug and disorderly conduct charges. So, okay, what do we take away from this? Some positive impacts on boy outcomes, 0 on girl outcomes. Overall, jointly, we can reject the hypothesis that there's none of these are significant. That none of these are. We can jointly reject the null hypothesis that all 8 have no effect. But when we look at these Q values, this is kind of when you look hypothesis by hypothesis, try to accounting for the false discovery rate. You'll see even for kind of the outcome, high school graduation, that was had the smallest p-value individually, is kind of only very marginally significant when you adjust for the false discovery rate. And that is kind of the price you pay for, you know, multiple hypothesis testing. So it's, we think there's something there, but it's not as, I guess, compelling as we would like. What do we have? Okay, so differential attrition. Okay, so we wanted to look at differential attrition. It turns out that if we're going to want to focus on whether the students were tested or not, because this is relevant, especially for the results on the test score results. We see here that there is some differential attrition for boys and for girls, the young boys and girls. So this says the top row says in all of the post-policy years, about 30% of the time, boys in the control group were tested. And so that shouldn't strike you as unusual, because remember, many of these years, they were like 4 years old and weren't even in school yet, so they shouldn't have been tested. This is completely unconditional. These folks wouldn't have been tested until they reached age 8. But the difference is what's concerning, and this suggests that there's about 1.2 percentage point greater probability that boys in the treatment group would be tested. Looks like it's partly because they enrolled in the public schools more often, and partly that they were just kind of tested more often, conditional on that. But this is, this is certainly a concern. Like if we thought attrition was completely random with regard to the outcome, we wouldn't be concerned at all. But if we think, for example, boys who, if you get a voucher, you're going to keep your more troubled children in school because in the public school system because you think you're able to better deal with them now in your new context. That could create some bias. That would bias our effects downward. I think what we're going to do here, I'm going to show you a bounding exercise, and this is where Eric's very cool graphic comes in. I'm going to show you a bounding exercise, but basically it's going to be very imprecise, and it's going to surround no effect, and so it's not going to be terribly informative. I think the most, potentially, I think the most compelling evidence to suggest that the boy test score effects really are believable here is that the differential attrition is exactly the same for boys and girls. And Tom and Sean, you can tell me if you believe this. But the differential attrition is basically exactly the same for boys and girls. And yet the test score effects are very different for boys and girls. And so you'd have to be a kind of a more complicated story of the differential attrition for one gender was operating one way and the differential attrition for another gender was operating a different way. But that's, but I think this is, the next graph I think is interesting. I'm not sure how many of you have done bounding exercises, but David Lee is an econometrician at Princeton who kind of developed a kind of more forgiving bounds approach than what people have typically used. And so what it basically involves is if you have a case here with the control group and the treatment group, and imagine that you have outcomes for about 70% of the control group and 80% of the treatment group, so you have differential attrition, 10% here. And imagine that you kind of ordered your people, so the people up here are the ones with the best outcomes, right? Kind of order all the people, all the treatment group people with test scores from the lowest scoring treatment group person to the highest scoring treatment group person, and the same for the control group. So what this idea is you're going to trim off either the top or the bottom group to get the upper and lower bound. So to get the lower bound of the treatment effect, you're going to say, okay, we're going to chop off this set, this kind of 10% in this example here, of the treatment group, so we're going to have the same fraction in treatment and control, and then do your comparison here, kind of assuming that it's the best people that attrit when they attrit. Here you assume it's kind of the lowest achieving folks who attrit if they attrit, and you trim off this group, and that's how you kind of get these upper and lower bounds. And there are some assumptions embedded in this kind of. The one is a monotonicity assumption that basically says kind of if people are going to attrit, they're either going to be, it's all going to be for kind of a reason roughly in the same direction. Like you're not going to have some of the really good guys and some of the really bad guys both attritting kind of equally for at different times for different reasons. I think that's not an unreasonable assumption. And these are the bounds that you get. In this case, unfortunately, not so informative for our purposes. Okay, my goodness. Okay, I'm going to move quickly along here. So, exploratory analysis of additional outcomes and specifications. This is paring it down. Eric will tell you that I've been nice to everyone and not shown the like 3,000 coefficients that were actually estimated. Quantile treatment effects is one thing we wanted to look at. So like let's say we believe the positive test score effects for the young boys. Was this coming from an increase at the bottom of the distribution, the top of the distribution, uniform increase? So what we show here is kind of, the first column is essentially kind of the comparison OLS regression on the effect at the mean. And then this is the 10th percentile, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th. And so I think that we kind of lose a lot of precision when we go to the quantile treatment effects. But it's actually quite interesting. For both the young and the older males, it appears that the largest effects are at the top of the distribution, which is, and this is a distribution of low achieving students and low income students in general, but there are some, within this, there are some students that have, they're certainly kind of well above the average Chicago public school student. So I think this is something that we're kind of thinking about and is interesting to shedding light on this. Specific outcomes. Like I said, the crime reduction for boys is driven entirely by a reduction in murder, small numbers. The slight increase for girls is driven by drugs and weapons charges. Post-secondary enrollment. No significant effects on post-secondary enrollment or on type of institution. Haven't done a lot on that, but at first blush, it doesn't seem like there's much. And then when we're able to track these kids as they become adults and look at their labor market outcomes, we see no effects yet on employment and earnings. I don't think we really would have expected that because even the oldest ones are just in their mid-20s now. Okay, do voucher effects vary by time? So that you might expect them to increase or decrease with time for various reasons. Some inputs could be fixed in the short run, but variable over the long term. You know, it might take time to re-optimize childcare or schooling. There could be some sort of disruption of moving initially. Or the effects of the increased inputs could accumulate over time, which I think was what the question was thinking about. And so to examine this, we kind of estimate the same type of intent to treat model, where instead of having a single indicator for post-offer, we have a series of indicators, kind of the first year after offer, the second year after offer, the third year after offer, etc. And as before, the control group are always coded 0. So they're kind of identifying these secular time trends. And so what do we see here? We don't see anything really striking in terms of arrests. Maybe something a little bit at the beginning, but it's pretty imprecise. For the test scores, we see that, you know, again, it is imprecise, but kind of certainly the most consistent, strongest effects are kind of a little bit later on, so maybe benefits accumulating over time. And for girls, test score effects, not much happening. Okay, so understanding the mechanism. So now we're going to go through, so we don't have any really inside the black box, but we're trying to milk the administrative data for as much as it's worth. We have some stuff here on school mobility and residential mobility. We're actually going to be getting more stuff on changes in household composition and so forth later. But this is, so we have, I think, some suggestive evidence that voucher offer had a modest but imprecise positive effect for boys but not girls. What are some of the mediating mechanisms? Think about school and residential mobility and quality are some things we can look at. So here, we do see some impacts on school change. So there was a slight increase in changing schools. This was all voluntary in the sense that they didn't have to because of changing the grade level of the school. Notice that the distance, how far did they move? baseline to school distance. So they were attending schools on average, even utilizing the voucher. Basically, kids were going to a school that was only 0.4 of a mile farther away from where they had started relative to control kids. So they weren't moving that far when they were moving. And actually, this is, I think, a nice graph to illustrate that there really was this one, they moved, they got the voucher, they moved, they may have changed schools, but they may not have, and then they kind of stayed where they were. So it was a single kind of transition, and then not much after that. So it wasn't a series of apartment hoppings or anything like that. And now school quality. So they moved, they didn't go very far away, and they ended up in schools that were virtually identical to the schools that their control peers were attending. So kind of as we kind of look through this, it's we wouldn't be surprised by kind of a lack of effects on educational outcomes. And so this was just looking at the school average test scores by time. This wasn't really changing much over time. So what kind of neighborhoods did they go to? They went to, this is looking at two snapshots. One is 2005, one is 2012. Again, they moved only not too far away from where they had started. There does look to be, by 2012, they had moved, well, the neighborhoods they were living in 2012 did look slightly less poor than the comparison group, either because they had moved to less poor areas, or I think what this suggests, the difference between 05 and 12 suggests, is that they moved to areas that were not declining as fast, or perhaps slightly improving relative to the comparison group. So I think very modest, if any, school or neighborhood change. Some, but modest, and for the neighborhood change, only very, very late in the game. Okay, so this is basically, that's what I have for the simple program evaluation part of this. There'll be lots more, hopefully, that we're adding in the future. I'm sure Eric is glad to know that. But so what can our analysis say about the general impact of income on long-run outcomes? So there's several channels through which the voucher could operate, including these housing and neighborhood quality effects. There's no way to perfectly disentangle these individual effects because this treatment's a package, but I think we can think about kind of bounding this in some useful ways. So what we're going to do is I'm going to first show you how to kind of calculate the value of a housing voucher. So like I said, individuals get cash and housing as a result of this. So basically their cash, kind of discretionary income, is their baseline rent, how much they were paying initially, minus what they are individually required to contribute. So if they were paying $800 in rent, but they're a month, and they're only required when they get a housing voucher to contribute $300 a month in rent, that's $500 a month in rent that they don't have to pay. That's $6,000 a year, right? How much are they going to get in housing? And that's kind of discretionary income that they can use for other purposes. How much additional housing do they kind of get to consume implicitly? Well, their baseline rent, let's say it was $800, they were paying $800 and getting an apartment worth $800 before. The FMR for them is $1,200. They will almost always lease exactly at the FMR. So they're $1,200 minus $800, they're getting $400 more of apartment every month, which is kind of, you might say like $3,000 in how additional housing consumption every year. And the total subsidy, kind of like the government's outlay, how much is this costing the government, is basically the discretionary income plus the housing. And so we can calculate, for each of the families, we can calculate this using our data. We have kind of UI records to calculate their earnings. We know if they're receiving public assistance. We know kind of the general rental characteristics of where they were living. So we can calculate this, and let me just kind of go straight to this. So this is, I kind of highlighted the median because I was worried about some unstable results earlier. But kind of, this is the 50th percentile household in our family earned about $4,000, right? That's kind of earnings in the formal labor market. Their total income was about $13,000. This includes TANF, food stamps, EITC, Medicaid, etc. Their kind of the adjusted income is something you do for the purpose of the housing voucher. Their individual contribution is about $2,000. Their baseline rent they were paying is about $8,200. So you can immediately see that basically it's going to be close to $6,000 that they're getting in income. The FMR is about this. You walk through this, they're going to be able to take home about $5,000 in discretionary income and $5,000 in housing for a total subsidy of $10,000. And so, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly Sean's point. And like it could be that a savvy landlord is saying, okay, well, this is an $800 apartment, but we know that this family can spend up to $1,200. So we're going to charge them $1,200 on this, and so this would overstate the benefit they're getting. Right. So I guess in that case, like in the most extreme value, suppose this is 0, and so all this is worth is just $5,000 in discretionary income. So that's kind of like a worst case scenario. Or you could say that they're really getting, I mean, if you're thinking about this, what the effect this would have on their outcomes, either they weren't really able to buy more housing, it was just kind of landlords artificially raising the price, or let's assume housing has no positive impact, has 0 impact on graduation rates or test scores. Then we can, this is irrelevant for the outcomes we're looking at, and we would focus just on this. And so, I mean, what I'm going to show you now is trying to translate, how do our effects translate and compare to some of those other income supplement studies that you saw. So remember the Dahl-Lochner study, $1,000 extra of income through this EITC, which is kind of pure income, or much purer than this. Got 0.08 standard deviations for their minority children in their study. 0.08 standard, $1,000, 0.08 standard deviations. And we're going to be thinking about this and trying to kind of compare ours to that. So if you remember, overall, boys and girls combined, our kind of treatment on the treated is about 4 standard deviations. And so the question is, 0.04 standard deviations, if we want to get per $1,000, what do we divide that by? Do we divide that by $10,000, the full cost of the subsidy? That might be one extreme. We could say we could use the studies of equivalent variation suggesting that $10,000 study is really worth about $8,300 to families. And so we could divide that 0.04 standard deviations by 8.3. Or we could have the worst case scenario, let's say housing was worth 0 and or it wasn't really more housing, and we're going to divide that 0.04 by 5. And so any way you can imagine, I'm going to just show you a picture in a second, but whatever you do there, kind of whatever assumption you make from like the largest to the smallest, what we get is way, 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 way smaller than any of the prior literature would suggest. And so this is kind of the picture with the point estimate and the confidence intervals. So this is boys and girls together. This full subsidy is when we divide by 8.3, assuming like the equivalent variation. This is when we just basically divide by 5 and kind of assume the housing was absolutely no benefit whatsoever. this is the Dahl and Lochner study, and this is the Canadian Child Benefit Supplement, which compared basically one province to another over time. Quebec, it's very good to be in Quebec. So it seems, and this is for boys, where we kind of, for the studies we're going to look just at boys. I mean, so this is kind of getting at, I mean, one of the things that we're struggling with now, kind of with each other and kind of as the co-author team, is like, okay, we have the simple program evaluation. Was this program effective? Was it effective, period? Was it cost effective? What does it say about kind of the benefits of income or not? We have some positive effects for boys, for some outcomes. But, I mean, relative to the other studies, they're pretty small. And so what do we make of that? So this is graduation. Even like the kind of substantial graduation effects we found, right? 4 percentage points for boys. This is like the Native American study in North Carolina. This is boys only, which we had a very large kind of treatment on the treated, only assuming only the $5,000 was the full treatment. So it's it seems small no matter how you slice it. So I think what I'm taking away from this is, let's see. Okay, I'm going to skip this. There's a way that it's in progress about kind of doing this more formally with kind of using the voucher offer to instrument for things, but it basically captures that just simple calculation I did. So how can we reconcile this with other studies? Well, so for the Dahl-Lochner, I mean, we tried to the extent that we can to kind of use their design in our data, different time period, different data. But basically, when you try to replicate what they did, you get, using our data and time period and sample, you get much larger positive effects than we get with the experimental variation. So that makes me really worry about their identification and thinking that the EITC changes in the 90s were just not picking up the causal impact of income. How does this compare to the welfare to work experiments? Well, I think this is an interesting comment about like how income is used. I mean, I actually think that was a great paper and a really interesting insight. Their income they were measuring was income kind of constrained to be spent on formal center-based childcare, right? So I think the difference is that this is income that's unconstrained. We don't know exactly how they're spending it, but they certainly didn't have to spend it on center-based childcare. And so why don't we see larger effects of the vouchers on youth outcomes? I guess the second bullet point is we're not looking at the right places. We're not looking at the right outcomes. That kind of begs the question, so why don't we see bigger effects on high school graduation or test scores or criminal participation? Well, I mean, I think, back to Susan Mayer's work and some of the other work that does get in the inside the black box. I mean, when poor families spend money, spend discretionary cash, they spend it on things that are very sensible and that clearly have utility for them, whether it's eating out or getting, fixing the car or getting a new dishwasher. I mean, they spend it on very reasonable things, but things that probably don't impact directly a child's educational outcomes. I think these are I think that's kind of the leading explanation that I would have, which I kind of gets back to like the broader conundrum of kind of like the Helen Ladd, do you focus on poverty or do you focus on schools or do you try to do both? And if we have limited resources, what do we do? What I do is start to wrap up. So how cost-effective are housing vouchers in improving educational outcomes, and certainly kind of relative to other education-specific interventions? And I'm, started looking into this 2 days ago, and so this is in progress. But so it's small. Let's say we don't believe the other studies on income and long-term outcomes, and we think ours are right. But how does this compare to what else you could do with the $10,000? It's really, I found it's not so easy to answer. Some of the most effective education-specific policies I think we can all think of are ones that have like modest pecuniary costs, but very high political or institutional costs, or limited scalability. I mean, think of the school quality studies that are kind of winning a voucher to a higher quality school, some work in North Carolina, desegregation, several pretty convincing papers showing kind of shifts associated with desegregation, some of the work on urban charter schools, having an effective teacher. I mean, these are things that you can't say, okay, it costs X amount of money. There are other education policies seem promising, but there's kind of the long term, if you're thinking about effects 15 years down the line, which is kind of when we're measuring our effects, we don't have as good evidence as we'd like. There are a few, if you think about the graduation rate example, there's some, What Works Clearinghouse will kind of tell you the 4 or 5 programs that work with youth who have dropped out of high school to kind of recover and get them to complete. And there's some, like Job Corps or Jump Start or things like this that are actually quite effective, but they cost between $70,000 and $200,000 per high school completion they get you. So they're very, very expensive, and that makes kind of housing vouchers seem cheap. Okay, so this is where we are at this point. We think that there certainly seems successful in some ways, but I think our general conclusions, the outcomes on children we find are kind of small at best, and certainly small relative to other things one could have done with $10,000 per family. And I think that's where I'll leave it. So.
What would you think of a design that was similar to EITC, but using housing constructs, like for example, that is using a lot of development countries, like if you work, will give you this amount of
Oh, like conditional cash transfers?
Yeah.
So those would be conditional cash transfers, but that are conditional constrained cash transfers, like the Progress and so forth gives you pretty unconstrained cash.
But because the other study that you showed that had huge effects, right? The design was quite different. Like you have to work in order to get money. The EITC.
Oh, the EITC. Yeah, the EITC is a program that kind of has. Essentially, it's kind of negative tax, like kind of low-income folks kind of get money back from the government as opposed to having to pay it, and it does require you to work because it's based on your earnings. But so the variation they use in that study, what this is picking up is over the 1990s, especially from 93 to 96, there were big increases in the benefits that you got. There was not kind of same two-parent household, or two-child single-parent household, making this much, in 1993 you got this much of a EITC, and then there's legislation to try to improve it. So it was kind of it was just, I guess you're saying it was conditional on working though.
So that's kind of my question here. Like, it is the same just to give people money or make them do something.
I don't know. I mean, we don't have that. I guess one thing. Well, there's 2 parts to that. One of them could be by looking just at families that were working prior to winning the housing voucher lottery. You could look at whether there's heterogeneity based on kind of like this prior characteristic, because probably what the EITC is measuring is both like heterogeneity by type of person, kind of it's giving to the working type as opposed to the non-working type, as well as the incentive effect that you're measuring, that you were talking about there. So I think there's no, I don't, yeah, I don't know. I don't, that's a good question.
Do you have any speculations about why the effects are concentrated in the high scores among the lowest?
You know, I don't. I mean, that's the, we just, you know, this is something we just kind of did in the last few weeks, maybe last week. But, you know, I could make up, like ex post, I could make up some rationalizations, but I don't, and there's nothing immediately that jumped to mind. I mean, I think the challenge is here, it's like we have lots and lots of great data on one hand, but it's all what you get in an administrative data set. So it's not surveys, it's not ethnographic work. There is some stuff that we're going to do at the high school level. We can look more at grades and attendance and so forth, and I'll be looking at that. And that might get somewhat into that. But
Well, just a thought that might be related to that is, would you be able to see if the children themselves, as they grew older, if they stopped working after this? So maybe they had to work in order to supplement their parents' income, but this increased cash allowed them to maybe reduce their hours?
yeah, no, that's a good. So we have looked at the earnings, employment and earnings, and this is all one limitation is this is all earnings in the formal labor market. So I think there's ethnographic evidence by like Kathy Eden and others that there's like a non-trivial amount of earnings that poor households have that is not captured in UI records. So we looked at people that were 16 and older, the children here, starting when they were age 16, and looked at whether the treatment effect had any impact on their employment or earnings, and we didn't find any significant effect. But given kind of the, you know, kind of work among kind of really young folks or folks who are kind of in kind of like post-high school, I mean, I think there could have been something there that we might not have captured, but we didn't see anything when we looked initially. Eric, and then.
Has anybody in these the kind of housing vouchers literature tried to see if there's like a mediating factor of the kind of penetration of the Section 8 vouchers by neighborhood? And I'm trying to channel Martin here. This is in that, you know, one of the puzzles is like in a program like a Metco, where you essentially relocate the students for school.
Right. No. This is a. Other people have asked about this. Like, so you're thinking about like a negative peer effect.
In some sense, if it's a large migration, their peer group's not really changing. They're just moving to a Section 8 neighborhood.
Yeah. I mean, I don't. I think it can't be like they're moving along with their other people literally in this voucher, because I mean, I'm not worried about general equilibrium effects in that sense. I mean, this was a few thousand households out of like the Chicago MSA. This was
I'm not thinking the exact same peers, but I'm just saying, for example, like in Cleveland, Section 8 housing in the first-ring suburbs were very much very segregated areas.
Right.
And literally, it was a set of families that had all left Cleveland and moved out to Cleveland Heights, University Heights, whatever that first-ring suburb. But they all settled in the same place, and all the students, you know, even though they might be a different subset of the kids, all of them had the same background and experiences in their early education, and they were all going to the same school now, and they weren't getting a change in peer groups,
right.
Whereas like in Metco, there was complete change.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that's right. I mean, I think what we find here is there was certainly no change, appreciable change in school quality or school type. I mean, you can look at their characteristics of the peers, and there's absolutely zero there. They were staying relatively close to where they started. There was no change in kind of school quality, even if there was a change in the actual building. There was very little change in neighborhood characteristics, maybe a little bit at the very end of our sample. So I mean, I don't think there's a channel I don't think that this treatment is capturing any neighborhood effects. I mean, for better or for worse. I think it's kind of a wash there.
I'm just wondering if the mediating factor here is how big the change might have been in their peer group. Again, that distribution of changes in peer group, while on average might be 0, you might have some who've had a dramatic change in the average peer quality, while others have had a very small change or even a negative change. And I'm just wondering if that might be.
But I mean, that would have to be endogenous, right? You have like 2 families that get the voucher offer. One moves to the great neighborhood and integrates with lots of affluent people, and the other like stays close to home. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if like the one who moved farther to a better neighborhood did better, but I think you're going to lose the randomization at that point.
This might also be endogenous, but you look at the variation in average treatment effects across the achievement distribution, but you also have variation in baseline income, I guess, right?
Yeah, so we can definitely, I mean, one of the next things on the agenda is to look at effects separately by subgroup, like where subgroup is defined by pre-existing, pre-lottery characteristics. I want to think a little bit carefully before I jump into that. Because we don't have a tremendous amount of power, which I continually find frustrating because I think we had a larger sample than most. But I mean, it's going to be hard to interpret for a variety of reasons. If you have changes, if you look at heterogeneity by household characteristics, like number of kids in the household or prior family earnings or so forth, that's going to be associated with differences in what a voucher gives them, right? And so, but it's also going to be associated with kind of any heterogeneity and kind of the effect of the same voucher on a different type of person. So if you let's say compare the voucher effects of for families that had a really industrious working, moderately for this population high earning parent versus the not working TANF recipient parent, they're going to both have different cash and housing benefits from the voucher, but you also might think there's heterogeneity in just the underlying treatment effect for the same package, and it's going to be very hard to pull that apart.
So a relatively higher earning recipient of the voucher compared to the relatively higher earning non-recipient of the voucher. You were earlier talking about the different kind of consumer purchases that they're going to use the income for. So at the lower end, maybe they have to get the car. In the middle, they get the dishwasher. And once you get to the top quartile, now they can start making sort of human capital investments in their children. And that's the kind of...
Yep, that would be, that's a possible explanation. I mean, so I think we're definitely going to look at subgroups. I mean, that's on the agenda. We just have to kind of figure out which ones and how we really interpret that.
Anesthesia, industrial anesthesia, we've got that literature in Progress where they've really done a really nice job of actually, for some subset of families, capturing expenditures dollar for dollar. It might be worthwhile to kind of go and see there in terms of how that money was spent.
With the change from Progressa, like the kind of the treatment effect of Progressa on expenditure patterns.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I'm trying to just look at allocation of resources. I mean, it's a different context.
Yeah.
Completely, but it'd be interesting to see if any of that was attributable to income shocks. It might give some hints of what some of the expenditures were.
Okay.
I'm going to cut us off, one, because Brian is local. We can talk to him at any time. Thank you guys for coming to the first seminar. We have David Figlio in 2 weeks, so I don't think we have anything next week, but thank you very much.
Yes, and if I wanted, this is, okay, last one.